There is no record of that property in your name. The words should have sounded simple, administrative, routine, but they landed in my chest like something far heavier than paper and ink. I remember sitting perfectly still in the leather chair across from the desk, my hands folded in my lap the way I had learned to do in moments when emotion was not useful. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and old coffee, a place built for answers, yet somehow it was giving me none. Across from me, Attorney Daniel Reed adjusted his glasses and looked again at the file, as if it might change if he stared at it long enough. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins," he said more gently this time, "but I've checked twice. There is no deed, no transfer, no trust document connected to a lake house under your name or your son's gifting history." For a moment, I didn't respond. I had come here expecting clarification, maybe a missing signature, maybe a clerical mistake. What I did not expect was the clean absence of something that my own son had spoken about with complete certainty just days earlier. Just 2 nights ago, at Thanksgiving dinner in his Seattle home, David had leaned across the table with that familiar proud smile and asked, "Did you enjoy the lake house I bought for you, Mom?" I remember blinking at him, thinking I had misheard, thinking perhaps age had softened my memory. "What lake house?" I had asked quietly. "I never received anything like that." He had laughed then, a short, confused sound, as if I were the one forgetting details of my own life. And Victoria, sitting beside him, had gone still in a way I only noticed later when I replayed the moment in my mind. Now, sitting in this office, that same sentence echoed differently, like a door slowly locking somewhere I could no longer see. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked, my voice calm in a way that did not match the tightening in my chest. Daniel nodded and turned the screen slightly toward me, as though proof could be made clearer by angle alone. Rows of documents, financial summaries, property records, all neatly aligned, all missing the one thing that mattered. "If your son purchased a property for you," he continued carefully, "it would have passed through escrow, taxes, or at minimum a recorded transfer. There is nothing, Mrs. Collins. Nothing at all." I looked down at my hands then, at the faint age spots that had come with 67 years of life, at hands that had signed school forms, birthday cards, condolence letters, and now seemed suddenly unsure of their own history. "Then where did he think it went?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I expected an answer. The question hung in the air between us, unanswered, uncomfortable, almost misplaced in a room built for certainty. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people assume things have been completed when they haven't. Or someone else ensures they believe they have." The implication of that sentence settled quietly, like dust falling after something has been disturbed. My mind drifted back to the dinner table again, to Victoria's careful smile, to David's confidence, to the way the conversation had moved too quickly past my confusion as if it were something small. Outside the office window, Seattle's gray sky pressed low against the city, heavy with unspoken weather, and I realized that what I had thought was a simple misunderstanding was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Something constructed, something deliberate. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving night, I understood that the question was no longer about a lake house I had never seen, but about how long I had been living inside a story someone else had been carefully writing around me. I drove back from the attorney's office in silence, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel while the city of Seattle blurred past in shades of gray and steel. The radio was on, but I could not focus on the voices or the music, only on the single sentence repeating itself in my mind like a clock that would not stop ticking. "No record of that property in your name." I had lived 67 years believing that truth, once spoken by someone you trust, was a stable thing, something that did not shift beneath your feet. But now I was beginning to understand that truth could be arranged, edited, even quietly replaced, without anyone raising their voice. When I arrived home, the house felt unusually still. Thanksgiving decorations were still partially on display, a reminder of the dinner that had taken place only 2 days earlier. I remember walking through the kitchen where I had prepared roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, the same dishes I had made for decades, always believing that family meant continuity. David's laughter had filled that space then, and Victoria had moved through the room with polite precision, complimenting the food, but never lingering in conversation longer than necessary. At the time, I had interpreted her distance as shyness or fatigue. Now it felt different, like intention I had not yet learned how to recognize. I sat at the kitchen table and placed my purse beside me, staring at the empty chair where David had sat. I tried to reconstruct his words again, slowly, carefully, as if repetition might reveal a detail I had missed. The lake house, a place I had never visited, never signed for, never even heard described in detail beyond that single question. I closed my eyes and searched my memory. There was nothing. Not a conversation with a realtor, not a document in the mail, not a phone call asking for approval. And yet my son had spoken of it with absolute certainty, the way someone speaks when they believe something has already been completed. That night, I could not sleep. The house creaked softly around me, the familiar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic outside, but everything felt slightly disconnected, as if I were listening from another room. At one point, I got up and walked slowly through the hallway, my hand brushing against framed photographs. David at graduation, David at his wedding, David as a child on the front steps of this very house. Each image felt unchanged, but my relationship to them was no longer the same. I stopped in front of a photograph taken 3 years earlier, David and Victoria standing beside me at a summer barbecue. Victoria was smiling in the photograph, but even as I studied it now, I noticed something I had never focused on before. Her hand resting lightly on David's arm, not affectionate in an obvious way, but positioned in a way that suggested quiet direction, subtle placement. I remember thinking at the time that she was simply being supportive. Now I wondered if I had been mistaken about the nature of support itself. The next morning, I called David. He answered quickly, his voice bright in the way of someone already moving through a busy schedule. "Hi, Mom, everything okay?" he asked. I paused before speaking, choosing my words carefully. "I went to check on something yesterday," I said. "About the lake house you mentioned." There was a brief silence on the line, so short it might have been nothing, but I noticed it immediately. "Oh," he said finally. "Yes, of course. Did something come up?" I stood by the kitchen window, watching a delivery truck pass down the street, ordinary life continuing as if nothing had shifted. "The attorney says there is no record of it," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly, less certain. "That is strange," he said. "I will look into it. It must be a paperwork delay or something administrative." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "All right," I said softly. After we ended the call, I remained standing in the same spot for a long time, holding the phone in my hand without moving. I did not feel anger yet. What I felt was something more difficult to name, a quiet displacement, as if I had stepped into a version of my life that looked familiar but no longer responded the way it used to. Later that afternoon, I received a message from Victoria. It was short, polite, almost carefully neutral. "Hope you are doing well after Thanksgiving. Let us know if you need anything." I read it twice, then set the phone down without replying. For the first time, I began to understand that the answers I was looking for would not come from asking questions alone. They would come from noticing what people chose not to say when they thought nothing was being examined too closely. I told myself I would not let uncertainty take over my entire day. Yet by mid-morning, I found myself sitting at the same kitchen table again, staring at nothing in particular while my mind kept circling. Back to fragments of conversation from Thanksgiving. It was not just the lake house anymore. It was the way David had spoken with certainty, as if he were referencing something already settled in both of our lives. And it was the way Victoria had gone quiet at the exact moment his question landed between us. I began replaying smaller details, moments I had previously dismissed as ordinary. Victoria offering to clear the table before I finished eating. Victoria answering questions directed at David as if she already knew the answer. Victoria gently steering conversations away from topics involving finances or property. At the time, I had thought she was simply organized, perhaps even helpful in a way that made life easier for a busy household. Now I was beginning to see how easily helpfulness could also become control when no one was paying close attention. Around noon, I decided to call David again. I told myself it was simply to clarify details, but deep down I already knew I was searching for something more than answers. He answered on the third ring, slightly out of breath, as if he had stepped away from something important. "Mom, I am in a meeting. Is everything okay?" he asked. I hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I am trying to understand something about the lake house. If it exists, there must be paperwork somewhere. Could you send me whatever records you have? There was a pause, longer this time, filled with the faint sound of movement on his end of the call. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more measured. I will have my assistant forward everything, he said. There is probably just a delay in documentation. You do not need to worry about it. But I was already past the point where reassurance could settle anything. After the call ended, I sat in silence for several minutes, then stood and walked to my home office. I opened the filing cabinet where I kept decades of personal records. Tax documents, property papers, insurance statements, everything carefully organized by year. If there had been any transfer, any signature, any official correspondence, it would have been there. I pulled out folders one by one, placing them on the desk in neat stacks. The process should have been simple, straightforward. Instead, it became something unsettlingly empty. There was nothing related to a lake house, not even a mention. By late afternoon, a second message arrived from Victoria. This one was slightly longer. David mentioned you had questions about the property. We are sure it was handled properly at the time. Sometimes things are just delayed in the system. Try not to stress yourself. I read it slowly, focusing not only on what was said, but what was carefully avoided. There was no mention of when the property had been purchased, no location details, no explanation of how it had been transferred, and most importantly, no invitation for clarity. It was a message designed to close conversation, not open it. That evening, I decided to visit the neighborhood where David and Victoria lived. I told myself I was simply passing by, but I found myself parking a few streets away and walking slowly toward their home. The house was warm with light when I arrived, large windows glowing softly against the early evening sky. From the outside, everything appeared normal. A family home in a quiet neighborhood, perfectly maintained, exactly what one would expect from someone who had built financial success. But as I stood across the street, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. The movement inside the house was structured, predictable. Victoria moved through rooms with a sense of direction that suggested she knew exactly where she needed to be at every moment. David appeared briefly in the kitchen, speaking to her, then disappeared again as if guided by a schedule that was not entirely his own. I stood there longer than I intended, watching through the soft reflection of glass and distance. I did not feel like an outsider exactly. It was something more subtle, like someone observing a version of family life that was still recognizable, but slightly rearranged in ways I could not immediately decode. On the drive home, I began to understand that the question David had asked at Thanksgiving was not the beginning of this confusion. It was the moment it became visible. Something had already been in motion long before that dinner, something that had never included me in its design. And now, for the first time, I realized I was not simply looking for a missing house. I was trying to understand how much of my life had already been quietly redefined without my knowledge. I did not sleep well that night, not because of fear, but because my mind refused to stop assembling fragments of memory that had once felt harmless. Every detail from the past few years of David and Victoria's marriage began to shift in meaning, like photographs slowly developing into something I had not noticed before. I remembered how, shortly after their wedding, Victoria had offered to help organize my household paperwork, saying it would be easier if everything stayed centralized. At the time, I had been grateful. She had presented it as efficiency, something modern, something helpful for someone my age who had accumulated decades of documents. I now understood how easily convenience could become dependency when you were not paying attention to what was being quietly removed from your control. I also remembered how David had gradually stopped asking me about financial decisions, even when they involved things that had once been discussed openly in our family. Instead, conversations became brief updates, summaries already finalized, delivered in a tone that suggested my input was no longer necessary. I told myself it was because he was busy, building his company, managing responsibilities that demanded focus. But now I began to wonder if that shift had been guided by someone else, slowly and carefully. The next morning, I went through old emails on my computer, searching for any mention of the lake house, any conversation that might have taken place without my clear memory of it. Hours passed with nothing but routine messages, family holidays, and financial statements that showed no unusual transactions. The absence itself began to feel intentional, as if someone had made sure there was nothing for me to find. By midday, I decided to call someone I had not spoken to in years, Robert Hayes, a retired financial advisor who had once helped manage certain accounts for David during the early stages of his business. His voice was slower now, but still recognizable when he answered. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, I asked him directly if he remembered any property purchase connected to my name or David's personal accounts. There was a long pause on the line. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I would have been involved if something like that had gone through formal channels. I do not recall any transaction involving a lake property for family gifting." That answer should have been simple, but it carried weight because it came from someone who had no reason to question it. After we ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the empty space in front of me. The house felt different in daylight, not empty, but quietly observant, as if it had become aware of my questions. I began to think about Victoria more deliberately, not as a daughter-in-law, but as someone whose influence had grown in ways I had not measured properly. She had always spoken with calm confidence, never raising her voice, never creating visible conflict, but consistently guiding decisions toward outcomes that I did not fully participate in. I recalled a moment from a family dinner 2 years earlier when David had mentioned expanding investments, and Victoria had gently suggested that certain assets be managed under her supervision for efficiency. At the time, I had not thought twice about it. Now I realized how often her language centered on systems, management, structure, words that sounded neutral but always resulted in reduced visibility for others. That evening, I returned to David's neighborhood again, this time without telling myself it was accidental. I parked farther away and walked slowly, observing the house from different angles. It was then I noticed something I had missed before. A second vehicle in the driveway that did not belong to David, unfamiliar but consistently present in the same position, as if it had become part of the household itself. I stood there longer than I intended, watching lights shift inside the home, silhouettes moving in familiar patterns. I began to understand that whatever had been constructed around me was not a single moment of misunderstanding. It was a system of decisions, layered over time, each one small enough to ignore individually, but together forming something that now surrounded my life without my full awareness. And as I turned to leave, I realized that the only way to understand what had been taken from me was not to ask what existed, but to trace carefully what had been quietly redirected away from my sight. I stopped visiting David's neighborhood after that evening, not because I had found answers, but because I had finally accepted that standing outside his life would not reveal what was happening inside it. Instead, I began focusing on something more practical, the financial structure that surrounded everything they did. If there was no lake house in my name, then somewhere there had to be a trace of how David believed it existed at all. That thought led me back to the bank where David had once set up joint advisory access for certain family accounts years earlier, when he still trusted me to understand the basics of his growing business. I made an appointment under the pretense of reviewing my own retirement statements. The advisor assigned to me was a young man named Ethan Parker, polite and efficient, someone who spoke in careful, rehearsed explanations. I asked him first about my accounts, letting him go through the standard confirmations, and then I shifted the conversation slowly toward David's financial activity, using the excuse that I was trying to understand how family planning had changed over time. At first, he hesitated, reminding me of privacy boundaries, but when I mentioned that I had previously been listed as a secondary contact years ago, he checked something on his screen. I watched his expression change subtly, not dramatically, but enough to signal recognition of something he had not expected to see. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "there are authorized communications on file regarding property-related discussions, but they are managed exclusively through a third-party administrative account." The phrase immediately caught my attention. I asked him what that meant, and he explained that certain transactions or inquiries had been routed through a management layer associated with Victoria Brooks Collins, my daughter-in-law. I felt a quiet tightening in my chest, not shock, but confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect. I asked if I could see the timeline of when that arrangement began. He hesitated again, then showed me a summary view. It was subtle, almost invisible at first glance, but there it was. A gradual shift in account communication control beginning shortly after David's marriage. At first, it was labeled as convenience authorization. Later, it became primary contact preference. Eventually, my name disappeared from certain notification categories entirely. I stared at the screen without speaking. It was not one moment of takeover. It was a sequence of permissions, each one small enough to feel reasonable at the time it was made. When I left the bank, I walked slowly through the parking lot, not because I was confused, but because I was beginning to understand how structured removal actually works. It does not feel like loss at the beginning. It feels like efficiency. That afternoon, I returned home and opened a box of old correspondence I had not touched in years. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, and financial summaries from earlier stages of David's life, before his marriage, when he still asked for my opinion without hesitation. I began comparing dates. Patterns started to appear. Meetings I had been invited to that were later rescheduled without explanation. Documents I had once signed as a witness but could no longer locate copies of. And most importantly, references to administrative consolidation that seemed harmless on their own but now formed a consistent thread. By evening, I realized I needed something more direct. I called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, her tone immediately controlled, polite but measured. "Hello, Margaret," she said, using my name instead of a more familiar title. I told her I had questions about documentation related to property and financial coordination. There was a brief silence on the line, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion but from calculation. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," she replied calmly. "Everything related to family assets has been handled transparently through legal channels." Her words were smooth, but they avoided every specific point I raised. I asked her directly about the lake house. Another pause. "David may have been referring to future planning discussions," she said finally. "Sometimes he speaks about things in conceptual terms before they are finalized." That answer did not settle anything. It only confirmed that language itself was being used as a buffer, a way to make uncertainty sound like procedure. After the call ended, I sat alone in the living room as the light outside began to fade. I realized then that the most important detail was not whether a lake house existed. It was that multiple people had agreed to speak about it as if it did. And somewhere between those coordinated versions of reality, my own certainty had been quietly removed without my awareness. For the first time, I understood that what I was facing was not a missing property, but a carefully maintained agreement about what I was allowed to believe. I began to notice that the more I tried to confirm facts through official channels, the more carefully those facts seemed to be redirected before they could ever reach me. It was not obvious at first, only small inconsistencies that I could have easily ignored if I had not already been paying attention. A record that should have been available required additional verification. A question that should have had a direct answer was instead forwarded to someone else for clarification. Even simple inquiries about historical account access were met with polite delays and references to authorized coordinators. And every time that phrase appeared, I thought of Victoria. It was not proof, not yet, but it was beginning to form a shape that I could no longer dismiss. A few days later, I decided to return to something more personal, something that did not rely on institutions or systems. I went to David's childhood home, the house where he had grown up before his success, the place where memories were still physically anchored in walls and rooms. I told myself I was only there to collect a few personal items I had left behind, but in truth I was searching for something else entirely, a trace of continuity that could connect the David I raised with the David who now spoke of property I had never heard of. The house was quiet when I arrived. The new owners had maintained much of its original structure, but it felt altered in subtle ways, as if familiarity had been carefully preserved but slightly rearranged. The current occupant, a kind woman in her 50s, allowed me to step inside when I explained who I was. As I walked through the hallway, I felt the weight of memory in every corner, not emotional weight, but observational awareness, like I was reading a version of my life written in a different handwriting. In the living room, I paused near the old fireplace where David used to sit as a teenager. I remembered long conversations about his future, about trust, about family responsibility. He had once told me that success meant nothing if it could not be shared transparently with the people who mattered most. Standing there now, I wondered when that belief had begun to change. The homeowner offered me tea, and we sat briefly in the kitchen. During our conversation, she mentioned casually that a few years earlier, there had been legal visits regarding property history and archived financial records tied to the home's previous ownership. She did not remember details clearly, but she recalled that most communication had gone through representatives rather than family members directly. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else she said. Representatives rather than family members. The phrase echoed in my mind all the way home. That evening, I made a decision that felt less like choice and more like necessity. I opened my old laptop and began organizing everything I had gathered, not just documents, but timelines, messages, inconsistencies, and moments where communication had shifted away from direct contact. As I laid it out chronologically, a pattern became visible that I had not allowed myself to see before. The changes did not happen suddenly. They happened in transitions so smooth they appeared natural at the time. A phone call answered by an assistant. Instead of David. A financial update routed through Victoria's coordination. A decision postponed until further review. Each moment alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a quiet restructuring of access, responsibility, and awareness. I realized then that the lake house question was never just about a missing property. It was about the point at which my presence in their system had been reduced to something optional, something that could be filtered, delayed, or interpreted by someone else before ever reaching me. And in that realization, a deeper question began to form, not about what I had lost, but about how long I had been standing inside a version of my own life that had already been edited without my permission. I did not tell anyone about the file I had been building, not because I was hiding something, but because I was still not certain what I had truly uncovered. Each layer of information I collected made the structure around my life appear more deliberate, yet still not fully visible in its final shape. That uncertainty changed one morning when I received an unexpected call from an unknown number. When I answered, a calm female voice identified herself as Clara Mitchell from internal audit compliance at David's financial management firm. She asked if I had a few minutes to clarify a historical authorization issue tied to family asset coordination. The phrasing immediately caught my attention because it matched too closely with the language Victoria had used. I agreed to speak, and she carefully explained that there had been multiple adjustments over the years to how family-related financial requests were routed, particularly those involving property discussions or large asset references. According to her, the system was designed for efficiency, allowing designated coordinators to streamline communication and reduce administrative delays. I asked her directly when this system had been implemented for our family accounts. She paused before answering. Shortly after your son's marriage, she said. It was initially requested as a convenience feature, but it became the primary communication channel for most asset-related matters. I felt a slow tightening in my chest, not from surprise, but from recognition. It was the same pattern again. A change presented as convenience, accepted without scrutiny, and then gradually becoming the default structure through which everything passed. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking not about the lake house itself, but about how easily a person could be removed from the flow of information without ever being explicitly excluded. That afternoon, I returned to my records with a different focus. Instead of searching for the lake house, I began tracking communication pathways. Emails that once came directly from David now often had intermediaries copied. Financial summaries that used to be addressed to me personally were now labeled under broader family administration. Even holiday planning messages showed subtle signs of filtered coordination. Each example on its own seemed insignificant, but together they formed a consistent redirection of access. I also noticed something else. Victoria's name appeared more frequently than I had previously acknowledged, not in obvious leadership roles, but in logistical positions that connected decisions across multiple areas. She was present in scheduling, in coordination, in approvals that were never explicitly framed as final authority, yet functioned as such in practice. That realization forced me to reconsider every interaction I had dismissed as harmless efficiency. Later that week, I met David for lunch at a quiet restaurant near his office. He arrived slightly late, apologetic, speaking quickly about meetings and deadlines. I waited until he had settled before asking him about the communication structure surrounding family assets. At first, he looked confused, then slightly uncomfortable. "Mom, that is just how things are managed now," he said. "It keeps everything organized. Victoria handles most of the coordination because she is better at that kind of detail work." I watched him carefully as he spoke. There was no deception in his tone that I could detect, only acceptance. That was what unsettled me most. I asked him if he remembered agreeing to any change that removed me from direct financial communication. He frowned slightly. I do not think anyone removed you, he said. It just became easier this way. You were always included in anything important. The sentence sounded reassuring, but it did not match what I had experienced. After lunch, I walked back to my car slowly, thinking about the difference between being included in principle and being included in practice. The two were not the same, and somewhere between them, I had begun to disappear from the decisions that once defined my own family structure. That evening, I returned home and looked again at everything I had compiled. For the first time, I stopped asking whether the lake house existed. Instead, I asked a different question. If so many systems had been quietly rerouted around me, then how many other things had been decided in my name without my awareness? And more importantly, how long had it been happening before I ever noticed? I spent the following days moving between two states of mind. One part of me continuing to function normally in daily life, and another part constantly analyzing everything I had recently discovered. Conversations with David, messages from Victoria, even ordinary moments like checking the mail or answering phone calls all began to feel like pieces of a larger structure I had previously failed to recognize. I no longer trusted the surface level of communication. Instead, I listened for what was not being said. One afternoon, while reviewing older digital files on my computer, I decided to go further back in time, beyond recent years, beyond the marriage period, into archived documents from David's early adulthood. I was not searching for anything specific anymore. I was searching for consistency. That was when I found something unexpected. An old scanned authorization form related to digital account management, dated nearly 5 years after David had moved out of my home. My name was present on the original template, but it had been marked as inactive on a later revision. The modification was subtle, not dramatic. A small administrative update removing secondary access privileges. What caught my attention was not the change itself, but the timing. It occurred shortly after Victoria had begun assisting with what was described as family organization restructuring. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the document for a long time. It was not proof of wrongdoing. It was something more unsettling. It was proof of gradual replacement, step by step, through procedures that appeared legitimate when viewed individually. That evening, I made a decision to revisit the bank again, this time requesting a full historical audit of account access changes tied to family coordination systems. The process took longer than expected, and I was asked to wait in a private consultation room while the system compiled older records. When the financial compliance officer returned, she carried a printed summary folder instead of a screen. She placed it on the table gently, as if she understood the weight of what it might contain. Mrs. Collins, she began carefully. This reflects changes in access and communication permissions across multiple linked accounts over a period of several years. I opened the folder slowly. Inside, there were timelines, access logs, and authorization updates. As I scanned through the pages, I noticed a consistent pattern. My direct visibility into certain financial and property-related discussions had been reduced in stages, never all at once. Each reduction was labeled as administrative optimization or family coordination improvement. I asked when these changes reached full effect. The officer hesitated before answering. Approximately 2 years after your son's marriage became fully integrated into joint asset planning, she said. I closed the folder without speaking immediately. The room felt quieter than it should have been, not because anything had changed in that moment, but because something had finally been fully documented that I had only suspected before. After leaving the bank, I did not drive home right away. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot, holding the folder on my lap. The information inside did not accuse anyone directly, yet it reshaped everything I thought I understood about my position within my own family. I remembered holidays, conversations, and decisions that had once felt collaborative. Now I began to see them differently, not as moments of inclusion, but as moments where the outcome had already been prepared before I entered the room. That night, I received another message from Victoria. It was polite as always, asking if I would be joining an upcoming family planning dinner regarding future investments and property organization. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, not because I did not know what to say, but because I finally understood that attending such meetings had never been about participation. It had been about observing how decisions continued to move forward even in my absence. And now I was beginning to see the full shape of that absence more clearly than ever before. I did not immediately respond to Victoria's message. Instead, I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, watching the screen dim and brighten again as it timed out and lit up with every small movement. The invitation she had sent was framed as routine family coordination, another planned discussion about future investments and property organization. But after everything I had learned, I no longer saw these invitations as neutral. I saw them as checkpoints, moments where decisions were presented after they had already been shaped elsewhere. I finally replied with a simple acknowledgement, not agreeing, not refusing, only confirming that I had received it. When the day of the dinner arrived, I drove to David's house with a steady sense of observation rather than participation. The evening air in Seattle was cool, and the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, quiet, orderly, unchanged on the surface. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere felt different to me now. It was not tension that I immediately noticed, but structure. The way conversations were initiated and concluded. The way decisions were referenced without being re-explained. The way Victoria moved through the space with quiet confidence, as if she was not entering discussions but guiding them toward already established conclusions. David greeted me warmly, but there was a slight distance in his attention, as though part of his focus was elsewhere, processing multiple threads at once. Victoria smiled when I entered, calm and controlled, asking if I had been well since our last conversation. I answered politely, but I was no longer measuring comfort. I was measuring consistency. As dinner progressed, the conversation turned toward future planning, specifically about restructuring certain shared assets and organizing long-term family financial direction. Terms were used repeatedly that I had heard before: coordination, efficiency, consolidation. Each word sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a language that kept repeating the same outcome. During a pause in the conversation, I asked a direct question about the lake house. The room did not change immediately, but I noticed a subtle shift in timing. Victoria's response came first, not David's. She explained that the property was part of long-term planning discussions, still under review, and that formal confirmation processes were ongoing. Her tone was steady, almost rehearsed in its calmness. David nodded as she spoke, not interrupting. I looked at him carefully, waiting for him to confirm or clarify, but he simply added that these matters were complicated and best handled through the established coordination system. That moment was important, not because of what was said, but because of who did not speak first. After dinner, while others continued discussing future arrangements, I stepped away briefly into the hallway. I stood there listening to the muffled sound of conversation continuing without me. I realized then that I was no longer inside the decision-making process. I was adjacent to it, present, but no longer required for direction. When I returned home later that night, I opened the folder from the bank again, placing it next to my older documents. I compared timelines once more. Each layer reinforced the same pattern: gradual removal of direct access, increasing reliance on intermediaries, consistent redirection of communication through a single coordinating figure. Victoria's name appeared again and again, not as an overt decision-maker, but as the point through which decisions consistently passed. I sat back and thought about how easy it had been to accept each individual change when it happened. No single moment had been dramatic enough to resist. No single adjustment had felt like exclusion. And yet, when viewed together, the result was unmistakable. My presence had not been removed. It had been absorbed into a system where my input was no longer necessary for outcomes to continue. That realization did not bring immediate anger. It brought clarity. And with that clarity came a new understanding that if nothing in the system required my voice anymore, then the only way to understand its full structure was to see what happened when I stopped assuming I was still part of it. I began the next stage of my investigation with a decision that felt quieter than the others, but far more final in its intention. Instead of looking for what I was told existed, I focused entirely on what could be proven through independent records that did not pass through family coordination channels. I requested a full transcript of property-related inquiries tied to any address associated with David's financial profile, using only my legal identity and excluding any family-linked authorization layers. The process took longer than before, and I was asked twice to confirm my reasoning for such a request. I answered simply that I was reviewing historical financial accuracy for personal documentation purposes. Eventually, I was granted access to a limited report view under supervised conditions. What I saw inside that report did not confirm the existence of the lake house, but it revealed something more important. There were repeated inquiries submitted under property classification codes that referenced a lakefront asset in Washington state. Yet each inquiry was marked as unfinalized or pending administrative closure. More importantly, every one of those entries listed Victoria Brooks Collins as the initiating coordinator. I read the same line several times, not because it was unclear, but because it changed the direction of everything I had previously assumed. If the lake house had never been officially completed, why did there exist repeated administrative activity around it, and why was it consistently routed through a single person who had never once discussed it directly with me? That evening, I called David again. This time, I did not begin with questions. I simply told him I had reviewed some records and needed clarity. His voice was more cautious than before, less immediate in its reassurance. He asked what specifically I had seen. I told him about the repeated property references, the coordination entries, and the absence of finalization. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough for me to notice he had stepped away from wherever he was. When he returned, his tone had shifted into something more careful. He said that some early planning discussions had been exploratory, that nothing had been fully executed, and that sometimes administrative systems recorded intentions as active processes before completion. I listened without interrupting, but I noticed he did not once address why I had been told the property already belonged to me in conversation. Instead, he returned to structure, process, and system explanations. After we ended the call, I wrote everything down in chronological order, placing each statement next to the corresponding record. A pattern began to emerge that I could no longer ignore. There was a consistent difference between what had been communicated verbally and what had been recorded administratively. One version suggested ownership. The other suggested incomplete intention. And between those two versions, there existed a space where certainty should have been. The following morning, I received a message from Victoria asking if I could meet her privately before the next family discussion. The request was polite, framed as clarification and alignment before upcoming decisions. I agreed, not because I trusted the conversation, but because I wanted to understand how control functioned when it was no longer hidden behind group settings. We met at a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle, a neutral space filled with ordinary movement and background conversation. Victoria arrived precisely on time, dressed as always with controlled simplicity. She began by saying she understood I had been reviewing older records and that sometimes documentation can appear more fragmented than intended. Her tone was calm, but carefully structured. I responded by asking a direct question. Was there ever a completed transfer of a lake property into any family trust or personal ownership structure connected to me? For the first time, her response did not come immediately. She adjusted her hands slightly on the table, then said that the property was part of long-term planning discussions that had never reached final execution, but were often referenced in family conversations to explore future options. I asked her why David had spoken of it as already existing. She smiled gently, but it was not a smile that answered anything. She said that David often expressed future intentions in present terms, especially when discussing family security and generational planning. After that, she redirected the conversation toward general family organization topics, as if the question had been resolved by explanation rather than evidence. When I left the cafe, I no longer felt uncertain. I felt something more precise. There had never been a single moment of deception that I could point to with certainty. Instead, there had been a continuous blending of intention, language, and administration until distinction between what was real and what was described had become nearly invisible. And now, standing on the sidewalk in the cool Seattle air, I understood that the real question was not whether the lake house existed, but how many other things in my life had been shaped first as a story before I was ever allowed to confirm the truth behind it. I spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet observation, no longer searching frantically for answers, but instead allowing patterns to reveal themselves through repetition. Every conversation, every message, every small interaction now carried a different weight, as if I were hearing them for the second time with new understanding. David called once during that period, briefly, asking if I was feeling well after my meeting with Victoria. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed, as though he already knew what had been discussed but was unsure how much I had understood. I told him I was fine, and let the conversation end quickly. I no longer wanted explanations that arrived too late to change anything. On the third day, David asked me to come to his office. He said there were things he wanted to clarify in person. I agreed, not because I expected resolution, but because I wanted to see how truth behaved when placed in a room without distance or delay. His office was on the upper floor of a modern glass building in downtown Seattle, filled with clean lines and quiet efficiency. When I arrived, he was already waiting, standing near the window with a view of the city below. Victoria was not there, and that absence immediately changed the tone of the meeting. David asked me to sit, then began by saying that he understood I had been reviewing a number of historical records and that it might have created confusion. His voice was steady, but I could hear something underneath it, a controlled effort to maintain structure. I asked him directly whether the lake house had ever been fully transferred or legally completed in any form tied to my name. He hesitated, then responded that it had been part of a long-term planning discussion, something that was intended to secure future stability for the family, but had never reached final legal execution. I watched him carefully as he spoke, noticing that he avoided direct acknowledgement of what he had previously told me at Thanksgiving. I reminded him of that moment, of his exact words, and the certainty with which he had asked if I enjoyed the lake house. For the first time, he looked away. When he spoke again, his tone was lower. He said he might have described it incorrectly, that he sometimes referred to planned assets as if they were already established when discussing future intentions. I asked him why Victoria had consistently been the one handling all related communications. That question changed something in the room. He became quieter, not defensive, but visibly more uncertain. He said Victoria managed coordination because she was organized and detail-oriented, and that it had helped reduce complexity in family matters. I nodded, but did not respond immediately. Instead, I asked him when exactly that shift in coordination had begun. He paused longer this time before answering that it had been gradual, beginning shortly after his marriage when they started consolidating financial and administrative responsibilities to avoid duplication. As he spoke, I realized that he was not lying in the traditional sense. He was describing a structure he believed was normal, one that had been accepted over time without question. But acceptance and awareness were no longer the same thing to me. After leaving his office, I did not go straight home. I walked slowly through downtown Seattle, letting the rhythm of the city move around me while I focused inward. I was no longer searching for proof of a single event. I was tracing the architecture of a system that had formed quietly around me. Every document I had reviewed, every conversation I had replayed, every explanation I had been given now pointed to the same conclusion. The lake house was not the origin of the problem. It was simply the first place where I noticed the gap between what I was told and what I could verify. That evening, I received a message from Victoria again. This time, it was not an invitation but a request for alignment before finalizing upcoming family financial planning. I read it several times, noticing how carefully it avoided any reference to past discussions. It assumed continuity without addressing contradiction. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened my notes, where I had been documenting every inconsistency in sequence. As I looked at the timeline, something became clear that I had not fully allowed myself to see before. This was not confusion created by misunderstanding. It was consistency maintained through selective visibility. And for the first time, I understood that the question I needed to answer was no longer about what had been hidden from me, but about how much of my agreement had ever been truly informed at all. I did not respond to Victoria's message that night, and I did not attend the next scheduled family planning discussion. Instead, I began doing something I had avoided until then. I stopped reacting to their system and started observing its rhythm from the outside. The more distance I created, the more clearly I could see how predictable the structure had become. Every few days, there would be a message about coordination, alignment, or clarification. Each one assumed my participation was still part of the process, even when my voice had already been reduced to a formality. What changed was not their behavior, but my awareness of it. I began documenting every interaction with precision, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, wording, response timing, and most importantly, who initiated decisions versus who merely confirmed them. Over time, a pattern emerged that was no longer subtle. Victoria consistently initiated financial coordination topics, framed them as organizational necessity, and David consistently validated them after the structure had already been presented. My role, when present at all, was reactive rather than participatory. One morning, I received a formal request for attendance at what was described as a final review meeting for long-term family asset organization. The language was different this time. It did not invite discussion. It indicated conclusion. That detail alone told me more than the entire message. I agreed to attend. When I arrived at the location, a private conference space arranged through David's company, the atmosphere was unusually formal. There were printed documents on the table, neatly arranged, each labeled with categories related to property structure, financial coordination, and legacy planning. David was already seated, and Victoria arrived shortly after me. There was no small talk. The meeting began almost immediately. A financial coordinator, someone I had not met before, began reviewing documents line by line, explaining that the purpose of the meeting was to finalize the organizational structure that had been under discussion for some time. As they spoke, I noticed something important. The language did not reference approval. It referenced confirmation. Not what we decide, but what has already been arranged. I listened quietly as sections of documentation were reviewed, including references to property planning, trust structures, and communication frameworks. At one point, the coordinator mentioned a consolidated planning system that had been designed to streamline family asset management under a single coordination model. Victoria nodded occasionally, offering clarification when needed, while David remained mostly silent, occasionally confirming details when prompted. When the discussion reached a section related to historical property planning, I finally spoke. I asked directly how decisions had been recorded when one of the primary stakeholders had not been part of the communication chain. The room became quieter, not tense, but focused. The coordinator responded by explaining that all decisions had been documented through authorized representatives and that continuity of planning had been maintained through designated coordination channels. I asked who had designated those channels. Victoria answered before anyone else could speak. She said it had been agreed upon during early stages of family financial restructuring, when efficiency required centralized coordination to prevent misalignment. Her tone was calm, but absolute. I turned to David and asked him if he remembered agreeing to remove direct communication from certain categories of decision-making. He paused before answering, then said that it had not been framed as removal, but as optimization. That distinction was important, not because it changed what had happened, but because it revealed how it had been justified internally. Over time, removal had been renamed as efficiency, exclusion had been renamed as structure, and absence had been renamed as coordination. After the meeting ended, I did not leave immediately. I stayed seated for a few moments after the others had gathered their documents and exited the room. I looked at the empty space on the table where my input had not been requested, only recorded as acknowledgement. In that silence, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not a misunderstanding of a single event or property. It was a system that had learned how to function without needing my awareness, even while still technically including my name within its structure. And now, for the first time, I stopped asking where I had been excluded. I started asking how long the system had been operating on the assumption that my silence meant agreement. I left the meeting that day with a sense of final clarity rather than emotional reaction. Nothing new had been revealed in words alone, but the structure behind everything I had experienced had finally become visible in its full shape. What had once felt like confusion now appeared as design. What had once felt like miscommunication now revealed itself as controlled distribution of information. I drove home through Seattle in silence, not replaying arguments or conversations, but instead reviewing the architecture of what I had just witnessed. Every explanation I had been given followed the same pattern. A system was defined. A role was assigned. My position within that system was described as included, yet functionally absent from decision-making. That contradiction no longer felt accidental. It felt maintained. When I arrived home, I did something I had not done since this began. I stopped collecting new information and instead reviewed everything I already had as a complete set. I placed every document, message, and recorded detail across my dining table. Then I organized them not by date alone, but by direction of influence. Who initiated? Who redirected? Who confirmed? And who simply received the outcome? Once arranged this way, the pattern became unmistakable. Victoria's presence was not occasional or supportive as it had first appeared. It was structural. She did not interrupt decisions. She shaped the path through which decisions were formed before they ever reached me. David, on the other hand, functioned within that structure as validation. Not origin, but agreement after framing had already been completed. I sat there for a long time, not feeling shocked, but observing the absence of surprise in myself. A part of me had already understood this before I allowed it to become visible. That evening, I received one final message requesting confirmation of my attendance at what was described as the closing alignment review for Family Financial Continuity Framework. The wording was identical to previous invitations, but the tone now felt different because I understood its purpose. It was not a discussion. It was a finalization of a structure that assumed continued compliance. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I wrote one line in my own notes that changed the direction of everything I had been quietly building. If my presence was no longer required for decisions to proceed, then my absence would become the only way to observe what those decisions truly were without influence or adjustment. The following morning, I did not attend the meeting. I did not cancel it. I simply did not arrive. Instead, I remained at home and waited, not for explanation, but for reaction. It did not take long. The first message came from David, asking if I was delayed. The second came from Victoria, stating that final confirmations were still required for documentation purposes. Neither message expressed concern. Both assumed continuation. That assumption itself told me everything I needed to know. Later that day, I reviewed what had been finalized in my absence. Documents were marked complete. Structures were approved. Coordination channels were confirmed as active. My name appeared in acknowledgments, but not in decisions. That was when I understood the final layer. This system did not require my agreement. It only required my absence to be treated as silence rather than resistance. And in that realization, something inside me shifted quietly, not toward anger, but toward distance. Because once you recognize that your voice is no longer part of the structure you are being described within, the only remaining question is not how to re-enter it, but whether you were ever truly inside it at all.